The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Luanda as taxi driver Manuel Santos prepared for what would become the most dangerous day of his life. He had been driving the same route for 12 years, ferrying passengers through Angola's sprawling capital in his aging minibus. The vehicle, painted in faded yellow and blue stripes, bore the scars of countless journeys through potholed roads and overcrowded neighborhoods. But on this particular Monday in July 2025, Manuel wasn't thinking about his usual passengers or the familiar landmarks of his route. His mind was consumed by a single overwhelming reality that had kept him awake the entire weekend. The government had just announced a devastating blow to his livelihood. Diesel prices would increase by 33%, effective immediately. For most people in wealthy countries, such an increase might mean adjusting their household budget or choosing to drive less. For Manuel and thousands of other taxi drivers like him, it meant the difference between feeding their families and watching them go hungry. His monthly income, barely enough to cover rent and basic necessities, would now be decimated by fuel costs that had spiraled beyond his reach. Manuel's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he sat in the parking lot of the Taxi Association building, surrounded by dozens of other drivers who wore the same expression of desperation and anger. These men and women were the backbone of Luanda's transportation system, moving millions of passengers every day through a city where public transport was virtually non-existent. Their colorful minibuses, known locally as candongueiros, were more than just vehicles. They were lifelines connecting sprawling informal settlements to the gleaming office buildings and shopping centers where people worked and conducted business. The decision to strike hadn't been made lightly. The National Association of Taxi Drivers of Angola had spent weeks trying to negotiate with government officials, pleading for subsidies or a more gradual implementation of the price increases. Their requests fell on deaf ears. Government representatives spoke of economic necessity, of reducing fiscal deficits, and of long-term benefits that would eventually trickle down to ordinary citizens. But for drivers like Manuel, there was no long-term thinking when your children hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Manuel joined the growing crowd of drivers who had made the same impossible choice. They would refuse to work until the government reconsidered its decision. It was a desperate gamble that would leave the entire city paralyzed, but they felt they had no alternative. The strike was scheduled to last 3 days, but few drivers believed the government would respond so quickly. They prepared themselves for a prolonged battle that would test their resolve and their ability to survive without income. The atmosphere in the Taxi Association compound was electric with tension and solidarity. Drivers shared stories of families struggling to make ends meet, of children dropping out of school because parents couldn't afford fees, and of medications that remained unbought because every kwanza had to be spent on fuel. These weren't political activists or opposition party members seeking to overthrow the government. They were ordinary working people who had been pushed beyond their breaking point by policies that seemed designed to benefit everyone, except those who needed help the most. Manuel's own story was typical of his colleagues. He had started driving taxis after losing his job at a construction company that went bankrupt during one of Angola's many economic downturns. The taxi business had never been easy, but it had provided a steady income that allowed him to rent a small apartment in one of Luanda's sprawling neighborhoods and send his 2 children to school. His wife sold vegetables at a local market, adding her modest earnings to their household budget. Together, they had managed to build a simple but dignified life. The fuel price increase threatened to destroy everything they had worked to achieve. Manuel calculated that the additional costs would consume more than half of his daily earnings, leaving him with barely enough money to cover the vehicle's other expenses, let alone support his family. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Either the government would reverse its decision or he would have to find another way to survive. As the morning progressed, the crowd of striking drivers grew larger and more determined. Someone had brought a sound system, and speakers took turns explaining the situation to anyone who would listen. They spoke of the government's promises to diversify the economy and reduce dependence on oil revenues, but pointed out that these policies always seemed to hurt the poorest citizens first. Angola was one of Africa's largest oil producers, yet Its people struggled to afford the very fuel that their country extracted from the ground in enormous quantities. The irony wasn't lost on Manuel and his fellow drivers. They lived in a nation blessed with vast natural resources, yet poverty rates remained stubbornly high. The capital city of Luanda, with its gleaming skyscrapers and luxury shopping centers, existed alongside sprawling slums where millions of people lived without adequate housing, electricity, or clean water. The disconnect between Angola's mineral wealth and the daily struggles of its citizens had been growing wider for decades, creating a powder keg of resentment that needed only a spark to explode. That spark came in the form of the fuel price increase, but the underlying tensions ran much deeper. Young people, who made up the majority of the population, faced unemployment rates that exceeded 50%. Those lucky enough to find work often earned wages that barely covered basic necessities. Meanwhile, they watched as political elites and their business associates accumulated enormous wealth through their connections to the oil industry and government contracts. The taxi drivers' strike was about more than fuel prices. It was about dignity, fairness, and the right to earn a living wage. It was about a government that had been in power for 50 years since independence from Portugal, but seemed increasingly disconnected from the struggles of ordinary citizens. It was about promises of economic reform and democratic progress that never seemed to materialize into tangible improvements in people's lives. As the first day of the strike progressed, Manuel and his colleagues received reports from across the city. The transportation system had ground to a halt, stranding thousands of commuters and forcing businesses to close early. Government officials issued statements calling for patience and understanding, but offered no concrete solutions or willingness to negotiate. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both sides' determination and reveal the deep fractures running through Angolan society. Manuel went home that evening knowing that his life and the lives of millions of his fellow citizens were about to change forever. The strike that had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve his livelihood would soon become something much larger and more dangerous. The fire that would consume Luanda in the coming days had been lit, and there was no telling how far it would spread or what would remain when the flames finally died down. The second day of the strike began with an eerie silence that blanketed Luanda like a heavy fog. Streets that normally buzzed with the constant movement of yellow and blue minibuses stood empty, save for the occasional private car or government vehicle. Office workers who depended on public transportation found themselves stranded in distant neighborhoods, unable to reach their jobs. Markets that relied on the steady flow of customers brought by taxi drivers saw their sales plummet. The entire rhythm of the city had been disrupted, and the economic impact was immediate and severe. Maria Fernanda, a young mother of 3 who cleaned offices in the city center, stood at a bus stop that she knew would remain empty all day. She lived in Kazanga, one of Luanda's sprawling informal settlements nearly 20 kilometers from her workplace. Without the taxi drivers operating their routes, she had no way to travel to her job. The meager salary she earned was essential for feeding her children and paying rent for the single room they shared. Missing even one day of work meant choosing between buying food or keeping a roof over their heads. Maria wasn't alone in her predicament. Hundreds of thousands of residents found themselves trapped in their neighborhoods, cut off from jobs, schools, and essential services. The taxi drivers' strike had exposed just how dependent the city had become on this informal transportation network. Government officials had spent decades promising to develop a modern public transport system, but those promises had yielded little more than a few overcrowded buses that served only the most affluent neighborhoods. As the morning wore on, reports began filtering in from various parts of the city. Small groups of residents had begun gathering at major intersections, initially to share information about alternative transportation options. But the conversations quickly turned to broader grievances about the government's policies and the deteriorating economic situation. The fuel price increase that had triggered the taxi strike was just the latest in a series of austerity measures that had made life increasingly difficult for ordinary citizens. In the neighborhood of Sambizanga, a crowd of young people had assembled near a government building, holding makeshift signs demanding affordable fuel and better economic policies. Their chants echoed through the streets, calling for President João Lourenço to reverse the fuel price increases and address the unemployment crisis that left so many young Angolans without hope for the future. The demonstration was peaceful, but the anger in their voices was unmistakable. Similar scenes were unfolding across the city as the strike's impact spread beyond transportation to affect every aspect of daily life. Hospitals struggled to maintain their services as staff members couldn't reach their workplaces. Schools remained largely empty as both teachers and students found themselves stranded. Small businesses that depended on foot traffic saw their customer base evaporate overnight. Government's initial response was to minimize the situation's severity and urge citizens to be patient while negotiations continued. With the taxi drivers' union, Interior Minister Eugenio Laborino appeared on television, flanked by security officials, to announce that the situation was under control and that normal services would resume shortly. But his words rang hollow to people like Maria, who was watching her family's already precarious situation deteriorate by the hour. By midday, the peaceful nature of the protests began to change. Frustration that had been building for months and years was finally finding an outlet. In the neighborhood of Rangel, a group of unemployed young men began blocking a major road with rocks and debris, demanding that government officials come to address their concerns directly. When police arrived to clear the roadblock, tensions escalated quickly. The confrontation in Rangel became a turning point that would define everything that followed. What started as a peaceful roadblock turned violent when police officers attempted to arrest several protesters. Video footage captured on mobile phones showed officers using excessive force against young people who were simply expressing their frustration with economic policies that had left them without opportunities. The images spread rapidly through social media, inflaming anger across the city. 22-year-old João Quilwange had been at the Rangel protests since early morning. Unemployed for over a year despite having completed secondary school, he represented the frustration of an entire generation that felt abandoned by their government. When police officers began making arrests, João stood his ground, refusing to disperse from what he considered a legitimate expression of his constitutional rights. The confrontation that followed would leave him hospitalized, with injuries from rubber bullets and tear gas. News of the police violence spread rapidly through informal networks that connected Luanda's neighborhoods. WhatsApp groups, Facebook posts, and word-of-mouth communication carried reports of excessive force and arbitrary arrests. Each new account added fuel to the growing fire of public anger. What had begun as a strike by taxi drivers was transforming into something much larger and more dangerous. The government's response to the spreading unrest revealed the deep, authoritarian instincts that had characterized Angola's political system for decades. Rather than addressing the underlying grievances that had sparked the protests, officials chose to frame the demonstrations as threats to public order and national security. Police units were deployed throughout the city with orders to maintain order at any cost. Late in the afternoon, President Lourenço held an emergency meeting with his security cabinet to discuss the deteriorating situation. The discussions, according to sources close to the government, focused primarily on containing the unrest rather than addressing its causes. The fuel price increase was described as economically necessary and non-negotiable. Despite the obvious social costs, it was imposing on the population. The decision to prioritize security measures over dialogue would prove to be a critical mistake that escalated the crisis beyond anyone's ability to control. As evening approached, reports of confrontations between protesters and police were coming in from multiple neighborhoods across Luanda. The peaceful strike that had begun 36 hours earlier was evolving into something that looked increasingly like an uprising. In the informal settlements that surrounded the city center, residents prepared for what they sensed would be a long and difficult confrontation with the authorities. Young people organized themselves into groups to protect their neighborhoods from police raids, while continuing to demand government accountability. Older residents who remembered the civil war that had devastated Angola for decades worried that the country was sliding back toward the violence and instability they had hoped was permanently behind them. Night fell over Luanda. The city felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The taxi drivers' strike had exposed not just the transportation system's inadequacies, but the much deeper problems of inequality, unemployment, and political repression that had been festering for years. The government's heavy-handed response had turned a labor dispute into a broader challenge to the political order itself. Maria Fernanda, still stranded in her neighborhood, looked out at the empty streets and wondered what the next day would bring. The simple desire to get to work and support her family had been transformed into something much more complex and dangerous. Like millions of other Angolans, she found herself caught between a government that seemed indifferent to her struggles and a protest movement that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. The second day of the crisis was ending, but it was clear to everyone involved that the real confrontation was just beginning. The matches had been struck, and now the entire city was waiting to see whether the flames could be contained or whether they would consume everything in their path. The fourth day brought with it a silence more ominous than any noise could have been. As dawn broke over Luanda, the city resembled a battlefield from which the armies had temporarily withdrawn. Burned-out vehicles littered major intersections. Windows of shops and government buildings gaped like vacant eyes, and the acrid smell of tear gas still hung in the air. But beneath this deceptive calm, both sides were preparing for what everyone understood would be the decisive confrontation. In the presidential palace, an emergency session of the National Security Council had been in session since before sunrise. President João Lourenço, flanked by his defense minister and the heads of various security agencies, reviewed intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture of the protest movement's scope and organization. What had initially been dismissed as a spontaneous outburst of frustration was revealing itself to be something far more structured and threatening to the established order. The reports detailed protest activities that had spread beyond Luanda to at least 6 other provinces, suggesting a level of coordination that worried government officials. In Benguela, Huambo, and other major cities, similar demonstrations had erupted, often led by local taxi drivers and unemployed youth, but quickly attracting broader participation from teachers, nurses, small business owners, and even some government employees. The geographic spread of the unrest indicated that the underlying grievances were not confined to the capital but reflected nationwide dissatisfaction with government policies. Security officials presented the president with 3 options: negotiate with protest leaders and risk appearing weak, maintain the current level of force and hope the movement would eventually exhaust itself, or escalate the crackdown dramatically to crush the uprising before it could gain further momentum. The discussions that followed would determine not just the immediate response to the crisis, but the long-term character of Angola's political system. The decision to opt for maximum force was influenced by several factors that revealed the government's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation they faced. Intelligence assessments suggested that opposition political parties, particularly the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, were attempting to exploit the protests for their own purposes. There were also concerns about the role of social media in organizing and sustaining the demonstrations, with officials arguing that foreign influences might be involved in promoting instability. However, the most important factor was the government's unwillingness to make any substantial policy concessions that might encourage further challenges to their authority. The fuel price increases were described as essential components of economic reforms, backed by the International Monetary Fund, and reversing them would signal weakness that could invite additional demands. The logic was simple but fatally flawed. Crush the protests decisively, and the population would accept that resistance was futile. The implementation of this strategy began with a communications blackout designed to disrupt the protesters' ability to coordinate their activities. Internet services were severely restricted in areas identified as protest hotspots, and social media platforms were blocked or slowed to prevent the spread of information about police tactics and demonstration locations. The government calculated that breaking the protesters' communication networks would fragment the movement and make it easier to control. Simultaneously, massive reinforcements were deployed throughout Luanda and other affected cities. Army units that had been stationed outside the capital were brought in to supplement police forces, bringing with them heavy weapons and armored vehicles that transformed the streets into a militarized zone. Checkpoints were established at major intersections, and anyone found in groups of more than 3 people risked immediate arrest under emergency regulations that had been quietly implemented the previous evening. The new tactics were put to the test when protesters attempted to gather for what had been planned as a peaceful march to demand dialogue with government representatives. In the Viana district, several hundred people had assembled near a school that served as a community meeting point. They carried banners calling for job creation programs and an end to police violence. But their peaceful intentions were irrelevant to the security forces that surrounded them. The assault on the Viana gathering became a template for the government's new approach to dealing with dissent. Without warning or attempts at negotiation, police and military units launched a coordinated attack using tear gas, water cannons, and live ammunition. The protesters, who included many women and older people, were trapped in a confined area with limited escape routes. The resulting chaos led to numerous casualties and dozens of arrests, but also to images that would galvanize international condemnation of the government's tactics. Among those caught in the Viana attack was Dr. Carmen Lorenzo, a pediatrician who had come to provide medical assistance to protesters injured in previous days' confrontations. Her arrest and subsequent beating by security forces highlighted the government's willingness to target even those providing humanitarian assistance. Dr. Lorenzo's testimony, later smuggled out of detention, provided detailed accounts of torture and abuse that contradicted official claims about the humane treatment of prisoners. The crackdown extended beyond street protests to target the infrastructure of civil society that had supported the demonstrations. Offices of human rights organizations were raided, with computers and documents seized under the pretext of investigating foreign funding sources. Journalists who had covered the protests faced arrest or harassment, while independent media outlets found their websites blocked and their broadcasting licenses threatened. The targeting of civil society revealed the government's broader strategy of eliminating any institutional capacity for organizing resistance to their policies. Churches that had provided sanctuary to protesters found themselves under surveillance, while trade unions faced threats of dissolution if they continued to support the demonstrations. The message was clear. Any organization or individual that challenged government authority would face severe consequences. International pressure began mounting as images of the government's brutal response spread globally. Despite attempts at censorship, the African Union issued statements calling for restraint and dialogue, while the United States and European Union imposed targeted sanctions on Angolan officials deemed responsible for human rights violations. However, these international responses had limited immediate impact on a government that was more concerned with maintaining domestic control than preserving its international reputation. The economic costs of the crackdown were becoming apparent as businesses remained closed and essential services were disrupted by the security operations. The very fuel price increases that had triggered the crisis were becoming meaningless as the transportation system remained paralyzed and commerce ground to a halt. The government found itself in the paradoxical situation of destroying the economy they claimed to be protecting through their austerity measures. By the end of the fourth day, the death toll had risen to levels that shocked even those familiar with Angola's history of political violence. Official figures acknowledged 22 deaths, but independent estimates suggested the actual number was significantly higher. Hospitals reported treating hundreds of people for gunshot wounds, tear gas poisoning, and injuries sustained during police beatings. The scale of casualties marked a watershed moment in Angola's post-Civil War development. The government's strategy of overwhelming force had succeeded in clearing the streets and arresting hundreds of protest leaders, but it had failed to address any of the underlying grievances that had sparked the uprising. If anything, the brutal crackdown had created new sources of anger and resentment that would fuel future resistance. The families of those killed or injured, the communities that had been terrorized by security forces, and the broader population that had witnessed the government's willingness to use extreme violence against peaceful protesters would not easily forget or forgive what had occurred. As night fell over a city under military occupation, it was becoming clear that the government had won a tactical victory, while potentially losing the larger strategic battle for legitimacy and popular support. The Iron Fist had crushed the immediate protest movement, but it had also revealed the true nature of a political system that maintained power through fear and violence rather than popular consent. The consequences of that revelation would continue to reverberate long after the last tear gas canister had been fired and the final arrest warrant had been served. 2 weeks had passed since the government's violent crackdown had scattered the protesters and filled the detention centers with hundreds of arrested demonstrators. On the surface, Luanda appeared to have returned to some semblance of normalcy. The taxi drivers had resumed their routes, albeit with reduced frequency due to the higher fuel costs that had sparked the original strike. Shops had reopened, their broken windows hastily boarded up or replaced. Government officials proclaimed that order had been restored and normal life was resuming throughout the country. But beneath this carefully orchestrated facade of stability, a different reality was taking shape. In the crowded cells of Luanda's central prison, Maria dos Santos sat on a concrete floor surrounded by dozens of other women who had been arrested during the protests. Maria was a teacher who had joined the demonstrations not as a political activist, but as a concerned citizen worried about her students' futures. Many of her pupils came from families affected by the fuel price increases, and she had seen firsthand how economic hardship was forcing children to drop out of school to help support their households. The conditions in the prison were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of anyone who might consider challenging the government in the future. Overcrowding meant that prisoners took turns sleeping on the floor, with barely enough space for everyone to lie down at the same time. Food was scarce and of poor quality, consisting mainly of thin soup and occasional pieces of bread that prisoners had to fight over. Medical care was virtually non-existent, leaving those injured during the arrests to suffer without treatment. Maria's cellmates included women from all walks of life who had found themselves caught up in the protests for various reasons. There was Rosa, a street vendor who had been arrested simply for being in the wrong place when police swept through her neighborhood. Fatima, a university student who had been live streaming the demonstrations on social media, faced charges of inciting public disorder. Teresa, a nurse who had been treating injured protesters, was accused of providing aid to criminals. Their stories revealed the broad social base of the protest movement and the government's indiscriminate approach to punishment. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical deprivation. Prisoners were subjected to constant interrogation sessions designed to extract confessions and information about protest organizers. The interrogators seemed less interested in prosecuting specific crimes than in mapping the social networks that had made the uprising possible. They wanted to know who had organized which demonstrations, who had provided funding or logistical support, and who might be planning future resistance activities. Outside the prison walls, the families of the detained were organizing their own form of resistance through desperate attempts to secure legal representation and basic necessities for their loved ones. Esperanza Mendez, whose son had been arrested while participating in a peaceful march, spent her days traveling between government offices, police stations, and courts trying to locate him and understand the charges he faced. The authorities provided no information about detained individuals, leaving families to rely on rumors and occasional glimpses during court appearances to confirm their relatives were still alive. The legal system that was supposed to protect the rights of the accused had been overwhelmed and compromised by the political nature of the cases. Most court-appointed lawyers were young, inexperienced, and intimidated by the high-profile nature of the trials. Many seemed more interested in avoiding conflict with the authorities than in providing vigorous defense for their clients. Private lawyers who might have offered better representation were either too expensive for most families or unwilling to take cases that could damage their relationships with government officials. The show trials that began 3 weeks after the protests revealed the government's determination to make examples of the arrested demonstrators. The courtrooms were packed with security personnel, while family members and journalists were either excluded entirely or allowed only limited access. The proceedings followed a predictable pattern in which prosecutors presented evidence of the defendants' participation in illegal gatherings and crimes against state security, while defense attorneys were given minimal time to present counter-arguments. The testimonies that emerged from these trials provided a window into the brutality that had characterized the government's response to the protests. Witness after witness described being beaten during arrest, subjected to torture during interrogation, and denied basic medical care while in detention. Some testified about being forced to sign confessions written in Portuguese, a language many of them could not read fluently. Others described watching fellow prisoners die from untreated injuries sustained during the crackdowns. One of the most shocking testimonies came from João Kilwanje, the young man who had been injured during the confrontation in Rangel. Speaking from a wheelchair due to injuries that had left him partially paralyzed, João described how police officers had continued beating him even after he had fallen and was clearly unable to resist. His calm, detailed account of the violence he had endured became a powerful indictment of the security force's conduct and a symbol of the protesters' dignity in the face of state brutality. The international community's response to these revelations was mixed and largely ineffective. While human rights organizations documented the abuses and called for investigations, most governments were reluctant to take strong action against Angola due to its strategic importance as an oil producer and regional power. The African Union issued statements calling for respect for human rights, but took no concrete steps to pressure the Angolan government to change its behavior. Meanwhile, the economic impacts of the crisis continued to reverberate throughout society. The fuel price increases that had triggered the protests were still in effect, creating ongoing hardship for transportation workers and their customers. The violent suppression of the demonstrations, The third day dawned with a tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Across Luanda, people woke to a city that had been fundamentally transformed overnight. What had begun as a taxi driver's strike demanding affordable fuel had metamorphosed into something unprecedented in Angola's recent history. The streets that had been empty of public transport were now filled with crowds of protesters, police vehicles, and an electricity that suggested something momentous was about to happen. In the informal settlement of Calemba, 25-year-old Ana Cardoso was preparing to join what everyone knew would be the largest demonstration the neighborhood had ever seen. She worked as a street vendor, selling cigarettes and phone credit from a small wooden table outside a busy intersection. The taxi strike had decimated her customer base, but her concerns went far beyond the immediate loss of income. Ana represented a generation of young Angolans who had grown up after the Civil War ended in 2002, expecting that peace would bring prosperity and opportunity. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an economic system that seemed designed to exclude them. Anna's story was repeated across thousands of households throughout the city. Despite completing secondary school with good grades, she had never been able to find formal employment. The few jobs available were either reserved for people with political connections or paid wages so low that they barely covered transportation costs. Street vending had become her only option for survival, but even that meager income was threatened by government policies that seemed to make life more difficult for poor people while protecting the interests of the wealthy elite. As the morning progressed, Ana joined a stream of people walking toward the city center. The usual transportation routes had been replaced by human rivers flowing through the streets, carrying people who had decided that this day would mark a turning point. They carried homemade signs written in Portuguese and local languages, demanding not just affordable fuel but jobs, education opportunities, and an end to the corruption that had plagued Angola for decades. The government's response to the growing crowds was swift and overwhelming. Police units that had been positioned throughout the city the previous evening were reinforced with military personnel carrying automatic weapons and riot control equipment. Helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting warnings for people to return to their homes and avoid participating in what officials labeled illegal gatherings. The message was clear. The state was prepared to use whatever force necessary to maintain order. But the crowds continued to grow, fueled by a sense that this might be their only opportunity to make their voices heard. In the neighborhood of Sambizanga, a massive gathering had formed around a government building, with speakers taking turns to address the crowd through megaphones and sound systems powered by car batteries. They spoke about the fuel price increases, but also about broader issues that had been ignored for years. Youth unemployment, housing shortages, inadequate health care, and the persistent poverty that affected the majority of Angola's population, despite the country's oil wealth. The first major confrontation occurred around noon when police moved to disperse a crowd that had gathered near the presidential palace. The protesters were demanding a meeting with President Lourenço to discuss their grievances, but their peaceful demonstration was met with tear gas and rubber bullets. Video footage captured the moment when officers opened fire on people who were simply standing and chanting slogans. The images would later become symbols of the government's authoritarian response to legitimate popular demands. Among those caught in the tear gas was Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who had come to observe the demonstrations and offer support to participants. His presence highlighted the broad coalition that had formed around the protests, bringing together not just unemployed youth and taxi drivers but also religious leaders, students, and middle-class professionals who were frustrated with the government's performance. Father Santos would later testify that the police response was disproportionate and targeted. People who posed no threat to public order. The violence near the presidential palace triggered a chain reaction throughout the city. News of the police attacks spread rapidly through social media and word-of-mouth networks, inflaming anger in neighborhoods that had previously remained calm. What had been peaceful demonstrations transformed into more aggressive confrontations as protesters began building barricades and throwing stones at police vehicles. In the Calemba district, Ana Cardoso witnessed scenes that would haunt her for years to come. She watched as police officers chased protesters through narrow streets, firing tear gas canisters into residential areas where families with small children were trapped in their homes. The chemicals seeped into houses and shops, forcing people to flee into the streets where they risked arrest or injury. The indiscriminate nature of the police tactics showed a complete disregard for the safety of innocent civilians. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout the afternoon as both sides escalated their tactics. Some protesters began looting shops and setting vehicles on fire, actions that provided the government with justification for even harsher crackdowns. However, most participants remained focused on their political demands rather than criminal behavior. They wanted jobs, affordable living costs, and a government that responded to their needs rather than protecting the interests of a small elite. By evening, large parts of Luanda resembled a war zone. The sound of gunfire echoed through neighborhoods as police used live ammunition against protesters. Hospitals began receiving casualties with gunshot wounds, tear gas poisoning, and injuries from rubber bullets. The scale of the violence was unprecedented in Angola's post-Civil War era, marking a dramatic escalation in the government's willingness to use force against its own citizens. International observers who had been monitoring the situation expressed alarm at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The United Nations Human Rights Office issued statements calling for restraint and investigations into the use of excessive force by security forces. Neighboring countries watched nervously as Angola, one of the region's largest economies, descended into chaos that threatened to destabilize the entire southern African region. The government's propaganda machine worked overtime to portray the protesters as criminals and terrorists seeking to overthrow the democratic order. State television broadcasts showed footage of looting and violence while ignoring the peaceful nature of most demonstrations and the excessive force used by police. This narrative was designed to justify the crackdown and maintain support among middle-class Angolans, who feared social disorder more than they opposed government policies. However, the government's narrative was increasingly challenged by independent media and social media platforms that provided alternative perspectives on the events. Journalists who attempted to cover the protests faced harassment and arrest, but their reporting revealed the gap between official accounts and the reality on the ground. The images of police violence against peaceful protesters contradicted government claims that they were simply maintaining law and order. As the third day of the crisis came to an end, it was clear that Angola had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The taxi drivers' strike had evolved into a popular uprising that challenged not just specific policies but the entire political system that had governed the country since independence. The government's violent response had only deepened the crisis and created new grievances that would fuel continued resistance. Ana Cardoso returned to her neighborhood that evening with tear gas still burning her eyes and the sound of gunfire still ringing in her ears. She had participated in what felt like a historic moment when ordinary citizens stood up to demand dignity and justice from their government. But she also understood that the real battle was just beginning, and that the forces arrayed against them were powerful and ruthless. The fire that had been lit 3 days earlier was now burning out of control, threatening to consume not just the immediate issues that had sparked the protests, but the entire framework of political and economic power that had shaped Angola for half a century.